Hi, and welcome to Women versus Everything, a women's history podcast focusing on individuals who overcame adversity in the face of oppression. I'm Grace.
And I'm Jess. And in each episode, we will discuss a different badass woman from any period in history. One of us will research the individual, and the other one will research the wider story and context of the time, and then we'll sew it all together and see what happens.
And now for a brief disclaimer from the future.
Because this is our first episode, we have some difficulties with the quality of audio, where there was a little bit of an echo going on. We want to let you know that this is only for some parts of the episode and it's improved upon by episode 2.
And if you would like to support us so that we can get lots of nice fancy audio equipment and not have any of these problems in the future, you can chip in at patreon.com/womenvseverything. That's patreon.com/womenvseverything.
We have tiers starting at $1 a month. Exciting.
Yes, and every donation helps support the podcast.
Back to the rest of the podcast.
We are so excited to be bringing you this first episode. This has been a work in progress for some time, and we are really excited to be launching finally.
Yeah, so we met in Oxford in England, and I was living in the UK for only about 2 years at that point. And then Jess rudely left Oxford, but we kept in touch. And last summer, after I moved back home to Cork in Ireland with the coronavirus, I had this idea for quite a while of doing a women's history podcast. I don't know about you, Jess, but I felt like a lot of the women's history I was seeing out there was a bit like, there was this amazing woman and she went and she did the thing. She was the first one to do this. Isn't that great? And that was it, and I think a certain amount of that is the internet lifestyle that we live in, where everything is just very brief and short and snappy bullet points.
Yes.
But yeah, it always left me a little bit empty, like it's not that easy,
Yeah, no, absolutely. And that was what really drew me to this project. I think when you kind of brought me this idea and asked me if I wanted to work on it with you, is approaching things from the perspective of looking at the full context surrounding the achievements of all these amazing people that we're going to talk about and the struggles that they overcame as well. That was what I really loved about this.
Yeah, so I had this idea of telling the woman's story in the context of the time. So, for example, she did this. By the way, women weren't even allowed to vote at this stage, and this one completely changed the world. I want to hear more about the backlash. Like, I think a lot of us who stand on our own 2 feet in this world know, like, you get a lot of backlash, and you see women, non-conforming women in the media day after day getting a lot of backlash, and it's like that's just kind of written out of history by the patriarchy, washing their hands of the responsibility for the various levels of silencing those voices. And then I think once we started doing some research, we came up with this really fun format. One of us researches the person and one of us researches the time and the context and the culture they lived in relevant to the issues that this person was known for. You're going to join us on a journey, unless you've studied history, which neither of us have. Let's just put that out there.
If you've studied women's history, please come and be a guest on our podcast.
We'll hopefully learn about the intersection of lots of things like race, gender non-binary, presentations, and class and colonialism, along with feminism on the way. Definitely, we would love to make this an interactive experience. So we have a Gmail account, which is Women vs Everything. And we would love for you to interact with us through that as we go along, but send us your stories.
Yes, definitely, please. I've told a few friends about this podcast and I've already had some amazing suggestions. The person who I'm going to talk about the next time it's my turn to pick the person, I had never heard of and I'm really excited to talk about. So yay, give us ideas. We are also on social media. We're not on Facebook because we hate Facebook. We are on Instagram at Women vs Everything and we are on Twitter at WVEverythingPod. So this is season 1, episode 1. It's very exciting. Grace, how are you?
Yeah, I feel pretty nervous about exposing this to the world and stepping into something I'm gonna share with a bigger audience. Yeah, I really care what people think of me, so it's a bit vulnerable right now in my house.
Right. No, I feel that same actually. It's like, yeah, we're gonna put this out there and That's scary, but also exciting. So how's your week been?
I've really enjoyed some queer representation in cartoons this week on the
Oh,
bright side.
oh, that sounds fun. What have you been watching?
So I watched the new season of Disenchanted and a couple of seasons of something called The Dragon Prince, which is from some of the makers of Avatar: The Last Airbender, which I'm a big fan of. And it's just that like really important queer representation of there's no coming out story. There's no, oh, I've always been confused and hey, it turns out my best friend is gay and I'm gonna get with them. And yeah, I was very annoyed that didn't happen to me as a teenager. But it's just, it's just like this character we've known for ages just happens to have two moms, or this character who's been in a few episodes, we go to their house and their partner is the same gender as them. And it's just like, oh hey, it's really beautiful and it gives me a lot of faith. And yeah, especially in Disenchanted, it's got quite an like anti-hero princess, and she's just drunk all the time and she burps and she farts and she's just amazing. And she's pretty slutty. So, I've my hero.
I love just casual representation when it's just there and it's not made a big deal of. I think that's a real sign that things are getting better.
Absolutely. I think it's yeah, and it's I'm so happy for the generation of young people that, the animations are more so aimed at that they're growing up with that. I think it really matters. Sometimes when I speak to my much younger cousins, I'm just so in awe of like how different and automatic these things are for them. Like it's just there. And
Mm.
I love it. I thought this week we could give a shout out to the person who does our amazing theme song.
Yes, tell us about that.
Yes. So Alice Human is an amazing queer woman who is a good friend of mine and is also easy on the eye, which I think is just, I think when I came up with the idea for this, I'm like, how can I get my hottest, smartest friends together? So she's a drama therapist, and like a general like amazing soul. She's got a few websites that you can check her out on. She's got a Cargo Collective account, and she's got a SoundCloud where you can listen to that track called Seasons. And she's also part of a harp and voice duo called Reverb Voice and Harp Duo, which also has a SoundCloud account. And she just does a lot of amazing work for Extinction Rebellion and activism around England, protecting the English woodlands, which, yeah, I mean, maybe in the future, one day, people will be doing a feminist history podcast about her.
Yes, I love it. She's amazing. We love our theme song. So please do go and listen to her stuff and support her and all of the things. So today's episode comes with a trigger warning for discussion of suicide, for state and police violence against women, for torture, force feeding, and also for sexual violence as well. So if any of that is difficult for you, please feel enormously free to skip this one and please take care of yourselves.
So this week, Jess, you were the person researching the woman that we're going to talk about this week.
Yes.
Yeah, do you want to hit me with that name that I probably won't recognize?
Yeah, so this week we are going to talk about a woman called Emily Wilding Davison. A lot of people will probably know her name. She's a pretty well-known member of the Suffragette movement. She was born in 1872 and died in 1913. And the thing that she's most well known for actually is the way that she died, which we're going to talk about in a little bit later. But there's so much more to her than that. She did so many amazing things in her life and was just a complete badass in a number of ways. So yeah, I really wanted to explore more of that story today.
Amazing. I did wonder if it would be one of the suffragettes when you gave me the period to research, which is like kind of the later years of the Victorian era and the earlier years of the Edwardian era, the like turn of the century around then.
Right. It seemed like an obvious place to start for a women's history podcast, but also a good starting point, I think.
Yeah. So do you want me to tell you how shit things were for women back then?
Please do. Tell us all the ways that society sucked back then.
Well, okay, if you were a man, and especially if you were Queen Victoria, it was probably pretty great. I mean, the Victorian era is really looked back on by Britain as like Britain was a global superpower. We're talking post-industrial revolution, the kind of real formation of the middle class due to industrialization. Slavery had recently been abolished, but there was still a lot of countries that were technically still colonized and that therefore had some trade agreements with England. There was lots of rapid urbanization. We're talking so around the time that the nuclear family was the ideal. Children and the wife shrank to allow husbands a break from domestic tediousness. Women really weren't present in the public sphere. Politics, paid work, and public speaking were men's areas, and women were allowed to dominate the realm of domestic life, the care of the family, to spend money, to be in charge of the household finances when it came to those subjects. And women really only had identities that revolved around men and the care for men, like the daughter, the wife, the mistress. There was a poem called The Angel in the House, and that was like an exemplification of the idealized Victorian woman. And she had to be angelically pure and chaste and devoted to her family. But, it was kind of showing the moral values of that time. Yeah, women didn't really have any rights. They had like limited rights to their own body, the property, or their children, like marital disputes. They would lose their children at this point in history. Kind of
Wow.
as the Victorian era progressed, women were allowed to have some domination in religion as well, like especially in nonconformist churches, they offered roles that women could enter, which they did very eagerly, like talking in Sunday schools, visiting the poor and the sick, fundraising, missionaries. They could lead Methodist class meetings and pray with other women. And it was even a big thing for them to be allowed to pray with, to preach to mixed gender audiences. So it was a time when, I think a lot of this hasn't really changed, but the single mother was really treated like the bottom of society. Abortion was the most widespread form of birth control amongst all classes of women to prevent poverty and unemployment. Contraceptives were illegal, unreliable, and expensive. And there was like these concoctions which were to end your pregnancy, which would be sold in papers covertly as like feminine products.
Oh my goodness. And I
Yeah,
bet lots and lots of women got very ill and died from as a result of that going wrong.
completely. Because it was like, even though abortion was the most common form of birth control, it was still illegal. So it was performed by women, trigger warning, using crochet hooks.
Oh God,
I know.
that's horrendous.
Single mothers were the poorest sector in society, and they were disadvantaged for a few women's like women lived longer, often leaving them widowed with children. They had fewer opportunities to work. When they did find it, their wages were much lower than male workers' wages. There was disdain for women who had to work at that point. It was kind of like your man should go to work and create this domestic realm for you is the ideal. And women were often less likely to marry or remarry after being widowed, leaving them as the main providers for all their remaining family members. And they also had deficient diets because their husbands and children received more of the shares of the food. So many women were malnourished in trying to put their family first, and then also had limited access to healthcare. And there was a lot of, sex work was in existence, but it was greatly frowned upon. So, again, I feel not too different from today. Single mothers and sex workers were just the bottom rung of certainly white society at that point, anyway.
Hmm. So
So,
all things considered, not a fun time to be a woman.
Not a fun time to be born into, but what's great about Emily Wilding Davison is tor towards the end of the Victorian era, and especially into the Edwardian era, that all rapidly changed. It was a time of rapid change. So she was born into that and then was probably exposed to a lot of messages, a lot of fun messages about actually there's this alternative.
Yes, absolutely. So she was born into in 1872, as I said, into a middle class family. Her father, interestingly, her father and mother had a huge age gap. So her mother was 19 and her father was 45 when they married. And they had four children, of which Emily was the third, but her father already had nine children from his first marriage, which ended when his wife died in 1866. So yes, middle class background. Originally in London, moved to Hertfordshire when Emily was a baby, and she was educated at home. And then the family moved back to London, where she went to a day school until she eventually went and studied in Dunkirk in France for a year. She was a high achiever academically, so obviously she had educational opportunities that a lot of people, but especially a lot of women and girls, wouldn't have had at that time. So she attended Kensington High School and then won a bursary to Royal Holloway College to study literature. But sadly, when her father died in 1893, she had to end her studies early because her mother couldn't afford the school fees, which were £20 a term, which is around £2,500 in today's money.
It's a lot.
So it's a lot of money, especially for someone who's for a widow who's looking after four children by herself. So Emily left Holloway and went to become a live-in governess, but carried on studying in the evening. And eventually she saved enough money to enroll at St Hugh's College in Oxford, just for one term, which was to sit her finals. And this is really sad. This is a really sad part of the story for me. So she graduated, or she achieved rather, a first class honours in English, but couldn't graduate because degrees from Oxford were not awarded to women at that time.
Oh,
Yeah, so women could study in some of the colleges, not in all of them, but women couldn't graduate. Women weren't awarded degrees, which is just really, really sad.
yeah, I came across that in my research as well, that like exam results from the 1860s onwards suggested that women broadly did as well as men, but in the notable exception of mathematics. And it was thought at that time that women were like emotional creatures lacking the mental faculty to master mathematics. And I think at the time it was, and one of the careers that was open to educated women was a novelist.
Mm-hmm.
So it makes sense to me that she studied English. But yeah, first colleges for women opened in 1870s. It wasn't until the 90s that they were allowed to study side by side with men and take the same exams. And it wasn't until, yeah, 1948 they could get degrees. So, oh, imagine getting a first class honours and not. And I just want to say for people out there, Oxford is actually where Jess and I met.
Yes, yes. We neither of us live there anymore, but we both used to.
Yeah, the rent is too high,
Everything is too expensive in Oxford.
including degrees.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Oxford is wonderful, and I left my heart there in many ways, but my God, it's expensive.
I love it. I do love it. I miss it so much, but it's really still a city of like two halves, a bit like this story is, where you've got, the nobility and the middle class experiencing one type of lifestyle, and then the people that don't fit in and the working class experiencing a completely different reality.
Mm.
Um, and when I said earlier that like Emily Wilding Davison was alive in this time of movement, like in 1897, the first Women's Suffrage Society's NUWSS was formed, and that was made of like smaller organizations that had been around. So it was the first national one. And by the end of the century, the new woman had, the picture of women had changed from what I described at the start of the episode to someone riding a bicycle, wearing bloomers, signing petitions, and supporting the worldwide mission activities and talking about getting the right to vote. So this new woman image wasn't popular, but it was acknowledged as like, oh, this is how they are now, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. It was a really radical change very, very, very quickly in the scheme of things. So Emily did get her degree eventually, not from Oxford, but she did go and read for a degree at the University of London and graduated in 1908, when she was 35, which was only 5 years before she died. So it's that bit at least sort of has a happy ending, but it sort of also is doesn't, and is still very upsetting.
I wonder if there's campaigns for Oxford to give Emily Wilding Davison her recognized first class honors degree.
And I feel like there must be so many women, the ones that we've heard of and the ones that we've never heard of, who should by rights have been awarded degrees in those days and just weren't. I wonder if there's ever been a campaign to finally award them posthumously. I don't know. That's really interesting.
Let's find out for next week.
We will find out. Yes.
Ah.
Dear Oxford University, if you are listening.
Give us free accommodation and
yes. And by the way, give degrees to all these women who didn't get them.
exactly.
So yes, anyhow, when I was researching Emily Davison, the word that kept coming up again and again to describe her was militant, which I found really interesting. So she joined the Women's Social and Political Union, the WSPU, which was an organisation founded by Emmeline Pankhurst, who is probably the most famous of the suffragettes. And then she was a member for 3 years, and then she gave up her job as a teacher so that she could work full time for the suffragette movement. And she's got quite an impressive track record in those few years, which included being arrested on 9 separate occasions, going on hunger strike 7 times, and being force-fed on 49 different occasions.
Oof.
So that's an awful lot in the space of just a few years. And that's what these women were doing in the name of getting the vote, essentially. It was pretty intense.
That is pretty intense. I'm pretty shocked to hear about hunger striking happening in England because, being an Irish person, and I'm a descendant of a hunger striker.
Oh, really? Wow,
Yeah,
I didn't know that.
Joe Murphy, here in Cork, he went on hunger strike as, a political prisoner fighting for Irish independence. And he recently had his 100-year anniversary, actually. Yeah, it's like it's something I more so associated with like highly oppressed populations. And I guess no matter how much I learn about feminism, I still don't associate white middle class women as being in that highly oppressed category. It makes sense when I'm reading about this now, but I'm just noticing there's like a cognitive dissonance there for me. Yeah, like that is radical. Like hunger striking is radical action by desperate people. And
Yeah.
I really understand how that defined these women at the time.
Yeah, very much so. It was really this case of they'd been campaigning for years and years and years for the vote, and nothing was really happening. And every time they tried to take action, they were getting arrested and they were getting imprisoned. So it was action by desperate people.
There was a majority of support for suffrage in Parliament, actually, but it was only a handful of the ruling Liberal Party's leaders refused to allow a vote on the issue. And that was what resulted in the escalation in the suffragette campaign.
Yes, exactly.
I was just going to say, so that's crazy. And I wonder how much that is still happening today, where it's like only a few people with the most power are blocking the next popular and logical decision for people in equality.
Right, absolutely. And I'm sure it still happens in some kind of way. So the suffragettes were, by the early 1900s, they were beginning to run a series of demonstrations. They were lobbying Parliament, which was when really the arrests and imprisonments started ramping up. They sent an envoy of 300 women, who represented over 125,000 suffragettes, to go and argue for women's suffrage with Sir Henry Campbell Bannerman, who was the Prime Minister at the time. And he apparently actually agreed with that argument, but, quote, was obliged to do nothing at all about it. And he told the women to, quote, go on pestering and to exercise the virtue of patience.
Jesus Christ.
Yeah. And some of the women at the right, it's awful. And some of the women who he told to be patient had already been campaigning for women's rights for up to 50 years.
Oh my God.
This was not just they suddenly decided one day we want all this to happen now. This was decades of campaigning, and this is how it culminated, really. So they this thing that he said about telling them to be patient, it infuriated them, as you can imagine. And that was really when the protests started getting more, I don't know if extreme is the word, or more militant, but that was when it really started to ramp up to the next level. And fun fact, so the word suffragette was first used in 1906 by a journalist from our old friend, the Daily Mail.
Ugh.
Right, yeah, exactly. That was my reaction too. And it was designed as a term of ridicule. It was a term that he used to make fun of them, but they just reclaimed it. They were like, yeah, we like that. That's fine. We'll use that.
I love it. So it's like,
I know, it's great, isn't it? It's reclamation, which I think is brilliant.
oh, the Daily Mail being dickhead since the Victorian age.
Some things never change.
No.
Okay, so this continued, and the WSPU became really known for their acts of civil disobedience, for their acts of direct action, which included things like heckling politicians, holding marches and demonstrations, breaking the law because they wanted to force arrests, breaking windows in Parliament buildings, setting fire to post boxes, committing nighttime arson of unoccupied houses and churches, and then, when they were imprisoned, going on hunger strike.
Holy fuck.
Right, it's a lot.
I quite like the heckling politicians part.
I mean, I don't hate it as a strategy, honestly.
So when I was in the Oxford Drag Collective, there's a member of that called Professor Alfreda Nipple.
Amazing.
And she does a song called Milkshaking Fascists in the Park. So, I mean, that sentiment, it feels, is still there. So it's so funny, like it's like all these now quite revolutionary acts of disobedience. They've been around for a long time. They're not new.
No, absolutely. It's in some ways very similar acts that are being used to try and force this change that isn't happening in any other way.
Yeah, and one would hope that there's better prison conditions these days compared to what these suffragettes probably got.
Well, yeah, you would hope. So it was, and this is kind of where the trigger warnings really kick in. The experience that they had in prison was absolutely horrendous. So Emily Wilding Davison was arrested along with two other suffragettes, Mary Lee and Alice Paul, in July of 1909. And that was because they interrupted a public meeting that women were barred from, which was held by David Lloyd George, who was the Chancellor of the Exchequer at the time. She was sentenced to 2 months in prison for obstruction, but went on hunger strike and was released after just 5.5 days. But she lost £21 during those few days and stated that she felt very weak when she came out of prison. So really a lot of damage, I suppose, happening in the space of just a few days.
Horrific.
Yeah, it is. So she carried on protesting, she carried on with all this action, and was arrested again in September of that same year for throwing stones to break windows at a political meeting, which was, this time it was a meeting to protest the 1909 budget and was again only open to men. And she was sent to Strangeways prison that time, but went on hunger strike again, and this time was released after just 2.5 days.
Oof.
Yeah, and she wrote to the Manchester Guardian after she was released from prison to justify her actions. And she said that throwing stones was, quote, meant as a warning to the general public of the personal risks they run in future if they go to cabinet ministers' meetings anywhere.
Oh, wow. Okay, I can see how the word militant began to be used.
Yeah, absolutely. So these really, really quite intense tactics. And then she said that the action was justified because of the, quote, unconstitutional action of cabinet ministers in addressing public meetings from which a large section of the public is excluded.
Yeah, fair point.
Absolutely. You can't really call it public if it's only open to 49% of the public.
Yes, completely.
So she was undeterred and she was arrested again in October of that same year. This is all still in 1909, when she was preparing to throw a stone at Sir Walter Runciman, who was a cabinet minister at the time. But she acted in the mistaken belief that the car that he was in contained Lloyd George, the Chancellor of the Exchequer.
She's going for that guy again.
Right, absolutely. So she was charged with attempted assault, but she was released. But a woman called Constance Lytton, I'm not sure, who was with her, was in prison for a month. But Davison used her court appearances to give speeches in support of the cause, essentially, and extracts from those were published in the newspapers.
Wow.
Yeah, so they were really using the arrests and the trials and things as a platform to get their message across to a wider audience.
So the publicity was what it was kind of about.
Yeah, very much so. So much of it was about raising awareness and raising consciousness and making people aware of what was happening. So 2 weeks later, she threw stones at Sir Walter Runciman again at a political meeting in Manchester, and she was arrested, and this time she was sentenced to a week's hard labour. And she went on hunger strike again, but by this point, this was when the government had authorised force feeding on prisoners. And I think that's very important to note, that it was not just a couple of rogue prison guards or whatever doing something that they weren't supposed to be doing. This was fully government sanctioned.
Ugh.
Yeah, it's horrific. It's really horrific. And Davison said afterwards that the experience, quote, will haunt me with its horror all my life. It is almost indescribable.
Oh my God, that's horrible.
Yeah, it really is. So after she was force fed for the first time, she barricaded herself in her cell, using her bed and a stool, and to not let anyone enter. But the prison authorities broke one of the window panes into the cell and sprayed a fire hose on her for 15 minutes.
Oh my God.
So by the time they got the door open, the cell was 6 inches deep in water, and she was taken to the prison hospital. But then she was force fed again shortly afterwards and released after 8 days.
So, I mean, were these all short sentences on purpose, or were they made shorter by the fact she was on hunger strike?
I mean, they were fairly short to begin with. The first one was meant to be 2 months, but she was released after 5.5 days. The second one was 2 months, but she was released after 2.5 days. And the last one was supposed to be, I think it was supposed to only be a week, but it sounds like it was longer. But yeah, they were all, I think, intended to be fairly short sentences, but then were shortened more by the hunger striking until this point that they said that force feeding was authorized.
Wow, Jesus.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So after all of this, Davison sued the wardens of Strangeways Prison, and she won, and she was awarded 40 shillings, or £2, which is around £240 in today's money. So it's not a lot, really.
Not enough, no.
No, nowhere near, not even close, considering what they went through.
What did she sue them for? The mistreatment?
Yeah, for assault, basically.
God.
And there were questions about it asked in the House of Commons, but it seems like it was something that carried on. It wasn't stopped at that point.
Yeah.
But all of this, amazingly, I feel like if I went through something like that, I would probably just give up. I don't know. It's very hard to know what you would do in this situation, isn't it? But she didn't stop. She didn't give up, and she in April of 1910, so the following year, she decided that she was going to gain entry to the House of Commons to ask about the vote for women. So she entered the Palace of Westminster and made her way into the heating system, where she hid overnight. I know, it's so intense. But she was caught on a trip from her hiding place to find water, but wasn't prosecuted on that occasion.
Oh my God.
Yeah, So shortly after that, the WSPU put a temporary truce on their activities because there was a group of MPs who proposed something called a conciliation bill, which would have brought the vote to around 1 million women.
Oh.
Yeah, but that failed. The Liberal government at the time reneged on a promise to allow parliamentary time to debate the bills, so that failed. And at that point, the WSPU sent a delegation of around 300 women to present a petition, but they were prevented from doing so by the police. So this was on a day that came to be known as Black Friday, and there was many complaints of assault against the women, much of which was sexual assault specifically.
Jesus.
And there were 122 people arrested that day. Davison was not one of them, and the following day she broke several windows of the Crown Office in Parliament in protest of what had happened to her friends and fellow protesters.
All they wanted to do was present a petition to Parliament, and they weren't left enter the building, is it?
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah.
What the fuck?
Right, it's so horrifying. No, it was literally nothing. They weren't doing anything violent. They weren't doing anything aggressive. They went to present a petition, and that happened.
Oh, democracy at its finest.
It's great, isn't it?
Uh-huh.
So she was arrested at that point and was sentenced to a month in prison. She went on hunger strike yet again and was force-fed this time for 8 days before being released.
Oh.
So then we're into 1911. On April the 2nd, which was the night of the 1911 census, she went into St. Mary Undercroft, which is a chapel at the Palace of Westminster, and hid in a cupboard.
Oh, yes. Like the IKEA challenge, but political.
Exactly.
I love it.
So she stayed there overnight, the goal of which was to avoid being entered into the census. I presume that was a protest against not being treated like a full citizen, essentially.
Invisible citizens.
Yeah. So she was found by a cleaner. She got reported. She was arrested, but she wasn't charged. But the irony of all this is that she ended up being included in the census twice.
Oh my God.
Right, because the Clerk of Works at the House of Commons completed a census form to include her when they caught her, but also her landlady had included her as being present at the place where she was living at the time.
So even if her task did work, the landlady had included her anyway.
Yeah, it was a great protest. But yes, she ended up being entered twice.
Oh, the irony.
I know. So it was around this time that she started writing letters to the press, of which 12 were published in the Manchester Guardian and about 26 were published in the Sunday Times. And it was also around this time, towards the end of 1911, that she developed her tactic of setting fire to post boxes.
Oh my God.
Yeah, so she was arrested for arson on the post box outside Parliament and admitted to setting fire to 2 others. And at this point, she was sentenced to 6 months in Holloway Prison. So that's quite a substantially longer sentence than the ones that have come before.
Yeah.
So she didn't go on hunger strike at first, but must have done at some point because the authorities decided that she had to be force-fed between the 29th of February and the 7th of March, 1912, because they felt that her health was in decline. How that would help, I don't know. I suspect they were really just looking for excuses, but anyway, that's what happened.
Gross.
Yeah, so there were several other suffragette inmates at the same time, and on one day in June, they all barricaded themselves in their cells and went on a hunger strike collectively. But the authorities broke the doors down, force-fed them, and this was the point where Davison first tried to commit suicide. So she jumped from one of the interior balconies of the prison. She survived. She was injured, but she was caught on the edge of some netting. So she cracked 2 vertebrae, badly injured her head, but she did survive. And her stance on that was that she felt that, quote, one big tragedy may save many others. So it was very clearly an act of, desperation, protest. But it also sounds like it was maybe just the only way out she could see to what was happening.
Awful.
Yeah, really, 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 truly awful. And she never fully recovered from that. She suffered from her injuries for the rest of her life.
Yeah, brain injury as well. Yeah,
Yeah,
that's heartbreaking.
yeah, it really is. So after she got out of prison, she went to stay with a woman called Minnie Turner in Brighton, who was also a suffragette, and she ran a guest house called the Sea View that was kind of a holiday spot, but also was a kind of safe haven for suffragettes who had been arrested and who had been force-fed and things in the cause.
Amazing.
Yeah, so her final arrest was in November of that year in 1912, and she was arrested this time for, quote, attacking a Baptist minister with a horsewhip, um, having mistaken the man for Chancellor Lloyd George.
Oh my gosh. Oh, Emily. Maybe her eyesight wasn't the best.
Maybe, or maybe Lloyd George had a doppelganger. I don't know. I don't know. But yeah, apparently she mistook this man for him. Poor guy probably didn't know what was happening.
The horsewhip would be a sign of women's empowerment. I'm sorry, no, assault isn't funny. It's never funny, but just that, I mean, that sounds like something from a comedy movie, doesn't it?
It's really bizarre, isn't it? It almost sounds too bizarre to be real.
And again, the mistaken identity again, you know?
Yeah, for the second time as well. That's the thing.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, she just kept mistaking people for him, apparently. There we are.
And attacked someone with a horsewhip. Oh my goodness, like the most vicious one yet. And it's at the wrong person. Oh,
Weirdly, she was only sentenced to 10 days imprisonment for that. That feels like something like that would get longer, but there we are anyway. She was sentenced to 10 days imprisonment, but was released early after she went on a 4-day hunger strike, which was the 7th time that she'd been on hunger strike and the 49th time that she'd been force-fed as a result.
oh, good grief.
Yeah, it's absolutely horrifying to think that these women went through that just repeatedly so many times. So I think we do have to talk a little bit about her death because that's kind of the thing that she's most well known for by far. And she died in June of 1913. On the 4th of June, she, some sources say ran, some sources say walked. No one seems to really know for sure. But anyway, she walked or ran in front of the King's horse as it was taking part in the Epsom Derby.
Oh,
Yeah, and she was
was-
trampled by the horse and then died 4 days later from her injuries.
yikes.
Yeah. What's interesting is there's some real debate over the purpose of this. There's some real debate over whether or not she intended to kill herself. Some people have said that she was a martyr for her cause. Others have said that that's not an accurate term.
Oh, okay, so but she ran out in front of a horse that was, it's in a race going really pretty fucking fast.
Yes,
So she
absolutely.
had to be aware that that was a possibility. And, the same when she was in prison, she was like, she kind of had this attitude of like, I might die from this, but it would be worth it, wouldn't it? That sounds pretty martyr-like to me.
Yeah, I read this interesting paper that was called Emily Wilding Davison Secular Martyr question mark. So it's asking, is that what she was? And this person's take seems to be that she was not intending to kill herself, but she was aware that dying was a possibility and that she was kind of okay with that. She was willing to die for the cause.
Wow.
Yeah. So one of the things that has been cited as evidence that she wasn't suicidal is that she'd purchased a return ticket. So she had a return ticket on her at the time, and also that she had made plans several days later. So it wasn't a deliberate act of suicide, but she was obviously aware that that was a possibility.
Wow. Okay. So she hadn't gone to the race that day being like, this is what I'm gonna do, but that was within the realm of reality.
Yeah, very much so. She was also a committed Christian. She was an Anglican specifically. Some people have said that it's unlikely that a committed Anglican would commit suicide because that would mean that they couldn't be buried in consecrated ground. But she very much saw her work as a suffragette as part of her faith. Her kind of personal motto was rebellion against tyrants is obedience to God.
Oh, I like that.
Yeah, there was this real sense that she was serving God as part of her protesting and fighting for women's rights.
Yeah, yeah, and there is that thing where it's like, does someone who, even if it is willingly, sacrifices their life for a cause, is that really suicidality? I know that's probably a much bigger conversation, but I can't see a church, for example, saying that feels very different to taking your own life.
Yeah, it does. And the general consensus now has been that it wasn't about her wanting to die. It was about an act of protest that people couldn't ignore.
I mean, yeah, if there's something people can't ignore, it's that. I'm really sad it had to get that far, though, you know.
Yeah, it's absolutely heartbreaking. And, this was in 1913 that this happened. So she was only 40 at the time.
Wow.
Yeah.
And already somewhat disabled from injuries relating to her cause.
Super traumatized. She must have been by everything that she'd been through.
She really sacrificed everything for it.
Yeah. So something else that I found out as I was researching this, that's really sad. So the jockey who was riding the horse that day was injured, but he recovered very quickly. But many years later, in 1928, when Emmeline Pankhurst died, he laid a wreath at her funeral, and which he said was, quote, to do honour to the memory of Mrs. Pankhurst and Miss Emily Davison. It said that he was always haunted by what had happened, and eventually he killed himself in 1951.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, so he obviously never really got over what happened, even though obviously it wasn't his fault. He didn't do anything intentionally, but he was obviously really traumatized by that.
Yeah, it just shows the desperate state of mind I think Emily was in, where she didn't even think of that collateral damage. What she was intending to do was so important that even that collateral damage didn't really matter.
Yeah, absolutely that.
So sad. I mean, what year did you say she died again?
1913.
So it wasn't until 1918 that the Representation of the People Act came along to reform the electoral system in Great Britain and Ireland. So she didn't live to see the vote come in either. And it still took a good while after, such a dramatic event for that to get processed, really. It gave the right to vote for men over 21, whether or not they owned property, and to women aged over 30 with a premises with a rateable value above £5 or whose husband did. So property owners. And it also extended the government franchise to include women over 21 on the same terms as men. As a result of the act, the male electorate was extended by 5.2 million, and the women electorate was 8.5 million. So 2 in every 5 adult women could now vote. And I listened to this BBC podcast I really like, called Behind the Bastards, and it talks about like famous people in history, but that also, there was also a lot to criticize, and there was maybe also a lot of darkness about them. And kind of at the end, they take a vote about, did they do more right than wrong? Were they more good than bad? And, doing this research, it was like a very common thing I saw in criticism of this, suffragette movement or the first wave of feminism, is that it wasn't really about equality. It was about the right to vote and education for some women.
Oh, yeah, very much so. So something that's really interesting about this that I actually learned in the course of my research is that the Labour Party at the time voted to support universal suffrage, which is defined as, quote, the right to vote for all adult citizens, regardless of wealth, income, gender, social status, race, ethnicity, or any other restriction, subject only to relatively minor exceptions. But that actually ended up dividing the WSPU from the Labour Party on the basis that the WSPU had always been in favour of the property qualifications that applied to women's participation in local elections. So women who met certain property qualifications and who paid rates had been able to vote in local elections since 1869. So they actually didn't support this universal suffrage that the Labour Party at the time was pushing for. And this ended with, so Christabel Pankhurst was kind of leading the group at the time. And under her leadership, they really became a group that was organising amongst middle class women. And they stated their opposition to all of the political parties at the time. And that ended up with a small group of prominent members leaving and splintering off to form a separate group that they called the Women's Freedom League.
Oh, so the Labour Party said, okay, here we can give like all women the vote. Because I came across in my research that like everyone didn't have the right to vote until 1969. And there was a period where it was only women over 30 and with certain amounts of land and like marital status and like basically of a certain class could vote after this suffragette movement. So the Labour
Yeah,
Party was going to make it like voting for everyone, and the suffragettes turned it down.
I mean, I don't think it was as simple as they were just going to do it,
Okay.
because obviously it took years to get these things through. But what it says specifically is that they voted in favour of it. So it sounds
Okay.
like it's something that they might have been pushing for. But obviously, then it took several more years for anything to really come out of that, even in a relatively limited capacity. But yes, you are right that it was not until 1969 that everyone age 18 plus could vote in the UK.
Hmm. How old was Emily back then? Because would she have even benefited from what the WSPU was proposing? Was she old enough, and was she actually middle class enough to meet that criteria?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Okay, so we're talking about 1907. So hang on, let me do maths. So she would have
You're
been
my
old
maths
enough.
bitch. Jess is my maths bitch.
Which is hilarious because I'm not going to say I'm bad at maths. I'm not bad at maths. I was badly taught. I nearly failed my GCSE maths. Whole other story. We should do an episode on girls and maths at some point. It's a very interesting topic to me right now. Yes, but to answer your original question, yes, she would have been old enough. She was born in 1872, so she would have met the age criteria. The property criteria is a little more uncertain. She was born into a middle class family, as we discussed, but it's unclear what property she owned, if any, by this point in her life. And she wasn't married, so she wouldn't have qualified for it via any property that her husband owned, which some women could also do. So maybe, but honestly, probably not, I think is my verdict on that one.
Yeah, it's really bizarre.
Yeah, it's very strange. I find the idea that they oppose this idea of universal suffrage for everyone, I find that very, very strange.
Yeah, sadly, it just seems kind of like another instance of women not lifting other women up.
Yeah, and it's interesting how even these movements that were undoubtedly super, super radical for their time actually were quite closed off and quite bigoted in other ways.
Definitely. Yeah, and that's a huge issue. I think still today that, women's liberation movements that are only focused on a certain type of woman and that are about women gaining more power, not about all women gaining equality, kind of like wanting to match the privilege that their male counterparts have. We still see strands of feminism today that don't include rights for sex workers, are anti-social housing or are Black exclusive, are trans exclusive. And, it's the same pattern. It makes me very sad to see that, like, from the day dot of our fight for greater rights, this whole white feminist movement is based on, exclusion. Like today, I was just reading some stuff about the origins of white feminism, and it talks a lot about this, about how it can also end up being complicit in the patriarchy. That it's like, well, only women above a certain age are sensible enough to vote. You know,
Mm.
only certain types of women should be allowed to vote, even though all men can, because there's obviously something very wrong with women that don't conform. So it still can be very much in the reinforcing the gender roles, and that certain types of women are good and certain types of women are bad. That it's still, even though they were quite anti the angel of the house and hated being told to be patient, they were still kind of complying this thing of like, voting is a privilege and not a right that should be protected.
Yeah, it seems that way, which is just very bizarre to me.
Wow, that's a great story. Well done.
Yeah, so that's the story. Fun fact, just before we finish. So in 2018, which was the 100th anniversary of some women getting the right to vote, as we've just discussed, Transport for London came under fire with a very bad taste joke that was displayed at a tube station in London. So this was, you've probably seen the like whiteboards they have with the little jokes and thoughts for the day on and things.
Oh, yeah.
So this board that they put up in February of 2018 reads, 100 years ago, Suffragette Emily Davison died after throwing herself in front of the King's horse. History remembers her as being influential in giving women the right to vote. What history doesn't remember is her husband, who didn't get his tea that night.
Oh, God.
It's so bad. It's also wrong on a number of levels. It's like 2018 was not the anniversary of her death, that was 2013, and she wasn't married. So it's actually just wrong as well as being grossly sexist.
Oh, we've made so much progress.
Yeah, I know. And like people say sexism isn't a thing anymore. But anyway, someone took a picture of this and tweeted it and it went viral and they came under a lot of flack and eventually they apologized and removed it.
Good. And they should have donated to some feminist charities as well, because an apology means nothing without reparations.
TFL, if you are listening.
Yes. TFL, Oxford University, all you people, we're coming after you.
Yeah. So
I found a fun fact too on
go on.
the Wikipedia page. Sorry, I need to not laugh to be able to say this. On the Wikipedia page about suffragettes, there's a section called Male Suffragists, and it just has one sentence saying, males were also present in the suffrage movement.
That's it. That's all it says.
Yeah. So
wonderful.
there you go, men's. We did not forget about you.
We did not
Even though
forget
that's
about
not
you.
sourced, so.
That's hilarious. But I mean, good for them. We love our male allies, but wow, that's a great Wikipedia entry.
Oh, yes. Yeah, let's come after whoever added that bit in with horsewhip as well.
Yes, so that is our story of the week.
I think this is a good example of how heavy these stories get, where it's like violence and sexual violence that's been met towards women asking for any semblance of more from the very beginning, and finding out there was this amazing movement, and we were also the bad guys and not quite campaigning for equality and still doing harm by others, reducing harm for some. Yeah, this is a point where we do our basic bitch gratitude list, because we don't want to hang up on this podcast in a bummer.
So we're just going to talk about like things that we're grateful for this week.
Yeah.
Amazing. Do you want to go first?
Yeah, I'm really grateful for my dog, and I'll pay the dog tax on her Instagram. I'll stick up a picture of her. She's just really cute and adorable and playful and a diva, and she's making sure I get out of the house, which is really important. I'm also really grateful for I've been like, I'll talk about it in another episode, but I'm conducting my own research project at the moment, and I'm really grateful for my business mentor, who's an amazing woman called Sarah Romoli. So yeah, feeling like really supported by another strong, opinionated, loving woman is just, it's just the best. Yeah, being lifted up by other women.
So important. I love it.
Yeah. Yeah, what about you?
I also have a pet themed one this week. I am grateful for my ridiculous and wonderful cat, who I witnessed climb a radiator this morning, which I didn't know that was possible, but there we go. She did.
Jess will pay the pet tax on our social media as well and stick up a photo of them.
Yes, absolutely. Yes, cat tax will happen.
The only taxes I'm okay paying.
Exactly. Other than that, what else? What else is good this week? I'm looking out the window and it's raining right now, but the rain right now notwithstanding, I'm grateful for the fact that it's been sunny here most of this week because it means I've been able to get out for a walk at lunchtime every day, which has been really like doing my mental health a lot of good.
Amazing. Yay for walks. All that
Yeah.
exercise endorphins.
Yes. Super nice.
And here's just a little shout out, listeners out there. We hope to end or maybe do mini-sodes on a segment called Hometown Heroines. So basically, we're asking you to email us at womenvseverything@gmail.com with the subject title Hometown Heroine. Tell us about an amazing ancestor or living person that is in your hometown, maybe your county, not the continent. Get out of here with that. They need to be actual hometown for it to work. And whether, no matter what they did, which was big or small, like, some charity work, or, that they were ahead of their times in a certain way of thinking, or they did a really great study piece, or, maybe as dramatic as got themselves arrested, being totally radical and badass. Whatever, just send us in your stories and we would love to share them, and they might be inspiration for an episode as well.
Yes. Please send us in things because we want to talk about all the people that we don't hear about the rest of the time, as well as the ones who are more well known. So, shall we close out and let our lovely listeners go, and we will see them next episode?
Absolutely. So, on that note, fuck classism, love women.
Yes, love it.
Bye.
Bye. I can hear me echoing back at you. Do you have? Is there? I don't know if there's any way you can stop me echoing on your end.
I'll turn the volume down, but I can't hear an echo.
Okay. Oh yeah, that's better. I can't hear it now. Can you still hear me? Okay.
I can still hear you. Yeah.
Awesome.